Good morning, Frances.
Good morning, Mark. How are you?
Wonderful, and I'm thrilled to have you on the show.
Well, I'm honored to be invited. Thank
Well,
you.
thank you. You know, when I think of broadcasts about architecture and design in Los Angeles, I always think of you because you had your show DnA, Design and Architecture, ran for how many years here on KCRW?
18. It's
Wow.
amazing. It's a
And yeah,
lifetime.
it was an amazing program. Also, two of my other favorite shows that I just adored were two shows that you produced with Warren Olney at KCRW, and that was Which Way LA and
And to the
To
point.
the Point. Yeah,
Yeah,
brilliant
that's why I
shows.
joined Which Way. That's why I joined.
Uh-huh.
DNA was a happy, unexpected outcome. I joined KCW in order to be Warren's producer, and I started out as a volunteer because I admired what he was doing so much. And in fact, I spoke to him yesterday, and he's as chipper and sharp as ever.
Great. So, and you're also writing a book called Common Ground, Multifamily Housing in Los Angeles. And I'd love to talk a little bit more into the broadcast. I'd like to talk about your upcoming book.
Sure, thank you.
So, I know you're a great fan of Los Angeles, but give us a little bit of background. You're from Great Britain, but
Hmm.
how did you end up in Los Angeles?
Well, good question, and I guess that the same could be said of thousands or millions of us that choose to come here. But well, I guess I grew up in a really, actually, quite a architecturally wonderful city called Bath in the West Country, which is full of quite lovely Georgian architecture or
Sure.
neoclassical architecture. And my father was actually very active in working on buildings, so I was very much always interested in and surrounded by sort of conversations about design. But also as a child I was very, very interested in America, and in fact as a teenager I had various waitressing jobs, and I met American tourists, and I thought I like these people, I want to
Mhm.
move to America. But I always thought it'd be New York, as many of us did back then in the 80s, 70s, 80s. Anyway, then I wound up going to architecture school. I then worked for a magazine called the Architectural Review. And my first assignment for the Architectural Review, when I just left college, was they actually sent me to LA to come and really basically meet the new subversive architects, of the late 80s. And this was Frank Gehry and Tom Main and Erica and Moss and Craig Hodgetts and Ming Fung. And it was this sort of emerging, sometimes people call it a school, but it was certainly an emerging approach, I guess, to
Right.
architecture that felt so fresh and
And a new trend.
interesting.
Yeah.
And yes, well, if you recall that period, at the time there was, postmodernism was very much in
Yes.
vogue, and certainly in the UK and Europe also, something known as high tech, this sort of glass and steel. So there was this very sort of industrial kind of version of modernism that was in vogue, as well as postmodernism, which back in Europe or on the East Coast was very historicist in attitude. And I found, I mean, that's slightly generalizing, but here I was in LA, and I found just this incredibly kind of fresh take on rethinking, I guess, our relationship to modernism, I guess, in space, and the idea of sort of breaking out of the box. And the way Angelinos were doing it, this particular group, was so amazing. And anyway, I just found the place so engaging. Strange, definitely strange. Obviously, when you come from a European city,
And
especially back in the
a city
80s,
like Bath.
and a city like that, no,
Yes.
exactly, a city like that, which was absolutely steeped in, well, it was kind of actually kind of steeped in purifying liquid, maintaining it for tourists. It was actually it was actually sort of steeped in resistance to change. So
Well, and
so to
that's
be
one of the
honest,
reasons when I go
yes.
there that I adore it so much.
Well, adorable for people who visit it. No, Bath, like other historical cities, you know, Florence, Venice, Santa Barbara, you know, there's cities around the world that are absolutely exquisite. However, their very exquisiteness becomes their reason to exist, you know. So I must say that growing up in Bath, I recall very clearly my father working on buildings and getting very sort of frustrated at the kind of limitations that were imposed due to the overwhelming need to sort of preserve the place intact for the visitors. So one felt that you sort of felt like you were living in a postcard. And so as a consequence, I've always had a very bifurcated relationship to the notion of preservation. You know, on the one hand, I absolutely, you know, value building stock, like the building stock that I grew up in. And on the other hand, I absolutely got so excited by highly innovative designers. You know, when I was 15, I first saw the Pompidou Center, and I just thought that was just absolutely blew my mind. And whenever you can kind of bring together, blend the new and the old, I find to be very exciting and dynamic.
Yes. Well, Los Angeles is the perfect playground for experimentation. And I think that's one of the reasons so many young architects find this such an invigorating place. Is, you know, it is experimental. People are willing to try everything, so it's wonderful.
Yes, it's
So
true.
now, you know, you wrote an article that I read that I found really fascinating. I've always felt that, you know, man has never really learned to live in harmony with nature. And you wrote this article, I think it was for last December's issue of the Sierra Club magazine, and it was titled "To Build or Not to Build." And in it, you know, it was said the architecture and construction industry creates colossal carbon footprint. And is the solution more green buildings or not to build at all? And this article goes into several areas. I mean, if this is available online for people to read, and I found it very exciting. And I'd love to talk a little bit about this with you.
Sure. Thank you so much for reading it.
Well, how did this article come about?
Well, actually, it came about through, to be very specific, through a contact, someone I knew through my work at Witchway LA, actually, is now the editor-in-chief at Sierra Magazine. And when I left my staff position at KCRW, I guess he reached out to me and said, I'm now doing editing this publication, and would you write for me? Well, it so happened that at that very point in time, they had just announced two things that happened. One, they had announced the Pritzker Prize for 2021. And I was completely fascinated by the choice they made, because the Pritzker Prize, which is the top architecture prize in the world, typically it goes to an architect, sometimes a duo, but typically an architect who is innovating, who in some way is kind of advancing the language of architecture, which generally means they're building anew. And that's
Yes.
a kind of through line to every winner. And then last year, I should say, beginning of last year, they chose this Parisian firm called Lacatane and Vassal. I happened to have visited one of their projects back a few years in 2015. And what they do, or what they have become known for, is not building, but rather taking older buildings, often really unloved buildings, not lovely Georgian houses like in the town that I grew up in, but more really often rather bleak or seemingly very bleak buildings with perhaps sort of problems, not pleasant to live in. What might be known here as the projects, you know, sort of public housing,
ordinary buildings.
Ordinary buildings and buildings that have come to be perceived as actually quite sort of grim and unpleasant and unloved. These public housing towers in Paris and Bordeaux. And then what they've done is they've gone in and they have said, no, we're not going to tear down these buildings. People who've lived here do have lives. They have connections, and there is enough good about this building that we can work with. And then they essentially kind of wrap a kind of exoskeleton around these buildings. They add glass and lightweight structure to bring in light, to add more space. They actually told me that Jean-Philippe Fasal told me a few years back that they actually take inspiration from the case study houses. So they add a kind of a light structure that has as little of a carbon footprint as they can manage, you know, while still expanding these buildings. Anyway, they end up getting the Pritzker Prize, and they make a real case against demolition. They think it's very sort of, I guess, irresponsible to tear down where you don't need to. So I found that incredibly interesting, and it dovetailed. It sort of coincided with some work I was doing on a series for KCRW called Wasted, and Wasted, it aired last year. You can still find it online if you're interested. And it explored innovative thinking in California around dealing with waste electronics, waste food, waste plastics, whatever. Lots of really smart people working on this in the state. And in the process of doing that series, I talked to a lot of young designers, and it was incredibly fascinating to hear from them, people who now are leaving design school, and to hear several of them express a kind of, I guess it's called climate grief, but a real anxiety about their own chosen profession and the role of their profession, designers, probably a lot of us on the line here, this profession that we believe improves the world, makes people's lives better. And I was hearing from these young people a sense of anxiety about the footprint that they were going to be contributing to, and I was hearing from them comments along the lines of, we've already made enough. Why do we need to keep making more stuff?
Mm-hmm.
And this was incredibly interesting to me. So anyway, that coupled with the Pritzker choice, I felt something was in the air. And then I subsequently then talked to a number of people in preservation, as well as a number of people in sustainability, and found that they've been slightly, I don't want to say on parallel tracks, but they haven't necessarily been combining their efforts, because in the sort of sustainability kind of environmental movements, there's been a lot of pressure. There's been a tendency to think about using new solutions to create better buildings that deploy the most sustainable materials. And we're all familiar with that. And then within the preservation movement, there's been a great concern with preserving the buildings we love. But this way in which what Lacaton Vassal modeled was a convergence of the two that did something different. It was sort of, we don't need to build new with all the green
We don't
stuff
need to
to be green.
Yeah. You know, I was just thinking while you're speaking, you know, an example, downtown Los Angeles is the Hauser Wirth Art Gallery.
Right.
And that was the old, was it General Mills, or it was an old granary or something?
Yes.
And, you know, I visited the gallery a number of times. There's a cafe there, a bookstore. It's really a fabulous building. I wish I owned the building.
Yes,
it's incredible, and that's a great example of a building that was repurposed.
Yeah,
and,
extremely effectively. Yes.
Yeah, and so you know, I think people are becoming more conscious, and realizing that not everything has to be a big glass and steel building. That also, I think these buildings create these recycled buildings, and keeping some of our past creates a sense of humanity.
Yes, because it creates a sense of it holds on to memories, you know.
Yes.
It holds on to, and in fact, can I just say, ironically, the design school in LA that is probably associated the most with building a new, thinking completely out of the box, is SCI-Arc, Southern California Institute of Architecture. Look at the building they're in.
Yeah,
it's
incredible.
a repurposed freight train building, and it's great.
So I have a question for you, Frances.
Mm-hmm.
And this is something that I've always struggled with. I'm a person that always looks forward. So if we, how do we keep moving forward and progressing, um, um, and not get stuck living in the past? If we just keep recycling what we have, how do we keep moving forward?
Well, I I completely agree. That is the question. And I lived in a city that didn't want to move forward. And
Right.
you felt kind of stuck in the past, and you don't want that. And that's why the Lacton Vassal win was so very inspiring, because they are absolutely moving into the future, and they are taking buildings and they are transforming them. If you look at before and afters of those public housing towers that they've converted or adaptively reused, they do not look the same. They are not sticking in the past. They are saying these buildings that were made of concrete slabs, modular concrete slab construction, this was not pleasant. They did not have enough light. They did not have enough air. They did not have a sort of connection to the outside.
Outside.
So they,
Uh-huh.
yeah, so they go in with offering a completely different lifestyle to
Hmm.
the people that lived in those towers. They bring in a sense of connection to the outside. And again, as it happens, they're very inspired by the Los Angeles way of inside outside living, and they've kind of exported that to France, and then wrapped it around towers. But at the same time, they're completely acknowledging that the people in those buildings do have a history. They have been living there, for some of them, for 30, 40, 50 years. And to sort of uproot these people is not necessarily the right thing. Now, obviously, each project can be assessed on its own merits, but I definitely think, I mean, I'm sure, I'm sure many of us are familiar with the work of the Italian architect Carlo Scarpa, who set
Yes,
an
I
example for that, for this
loved his
convert.
work.
Yeah, amazing. And might I add, Peter Zumthor, who is responsible for the building that's going to replace the 4 buildings that have been torn down at LACMA, he has modeled really interesting convergence of old and new in some of his prior projects. Renzo Piano, who co-designed the Pompidou Center with
Right.
Richard Rogers, who sadly passed just a few weeks back.
Hmm.
Renzo Piano, absolutely does do the ultra modern steel and glass, but he also completely understands, probably because he comes from Italy, where they hold on to the past,
Yes,
very
yes.
with great with great respect for their heritage. He understands that you absolutely can combine old and new very effectively, and he did the repurposing of the May
May
Company
Company building.
building,
Sure.
yeah, for the Academy.
Right.
So there's such potential. It's a wonderfully dynamic uh, way of thinking about buildings, I think, or way of working with buildings.
Right. So, in the article, you mentioned, you talk about the carbon footprint of what these new buildings require. And I was kind of surprised. I don't know if people are aware I think, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the creation of cement, the fabrication of cement, is a huge portion contributing to the carbon footprint. I was never aware of that. I never thought about it.
And nor did I, and nor did many of us, because we're all going through a process of kind of learning, I guess,
Uh-huh.
about the contribution that we make to our sort of climate problems. And I think that the industry itself is learning year by year. And back 15 or so years ago, when we started, these rating systems started that supported the use of more sustainable materials, I don't think we were talking about the sheer volume of energy that goes into the making of cement, and the emissions that result thereof. And also, I think that this has probably maybe become maybe we've become more aware of it because of the sheer volume of construction that's happened in cities around the world over the last 2 decades.
And also right now, because of COVID, the scarcity of materials and the unavailability. I'm building a home right now, and I'm finding getting materials, I mean, the costs are ridiculous, but you just can't get certain materials. And in the design industry, we're designing today around, unfortunately, we can't always be as original as we'd like to be because clients want things now, and there's just so many things that are available. There's a shortage of materials, fabrics, labor, you know, and so vendors and so forth can't get materials today. So that's changing.
Yeah, no, it is. And what you've hinted at, though, is also the fact that in the last, I guess, I don't know, 30 years or something, in the design world, we've become far more used to ordering in goods from overseas. That's been the massive change. You go back to California, LA in the 1950s, and it had a total ecosystem of design and fabrication and crafts and marketing and that's why you've got a very distinctive West Coast look because you could find it all here. And I to the extent there's a that comes out of what you've just laid out, it's looking again locally for who are the great designers here and who's making fabulous textiles. Of course there's talent here, and a huge contributor to the carbon footprint that was also, I think, mentioned in that article is just the transport of goods, the transport of building materials, and it's become just mammoth. I mean, mammoth, the shipping that's going on. And I mean, is that what we need? Is that what we want? And in fact, I have been part of the media, and you know, we, I guess, in the media have promulgated this message of, you know, excitement about all these stuff that you can get from this place and that place and the other place.
Right, but it has its consequences, as you say.
It has a consequence. Sure. It has a consequence. And Instagram, you know, there's so many platforms that are just enticing people to get this fabric from India or this marble from Italy or this, you know, whatever it is. And we've sort of lost our enthusiasm for just getting something that's right under our noses.
Right. And it's not just with building. You know, it's, you know, what I said earlier about we haven't learned to live in harmony with nature. I remember, I guess it's probably been over 40 years ago, I was in Israel, and I was really taken how every single house had solar panels on them. And I thought, you know, I live in a desert. Southern California is a desert. And we haven't, we're just now getting around to considering that as something that we need to do. And it's been around, the technology and the usage of solar has been around for decades. And so it also, you know, I also think about that in landscaping. So I've never understood why in Southern California, people put in these expansive lawns. Now, in Bath, where you're from, a lawn would be sensational. You have water, but here we don't. Too much. And so what the hell are we doing putting in these enormous lawns and landscaping that we don't have the natural resources to maintain? And
well,
it's not just building, it's also in landscaping.
Yes, no, absolutely. And I would say that in the early days of LA, when the lawn became popular, and there was a taste for the sort of English style garden, you know, among other I guess, what's the right word? Garden, exotic is not necessarily the right word, but I mean gardens from other lands, you know, that people grew in LA, and some took very naturally, and the lawn not so well, and definitely that's changing. But that was in vogue, and now things are changing, and there's a great interest these days in the beauty of the succulent and the cacti, and it's
Yes.
gradually changing.
Yeah.
I will say that while I'm talking to you, I'm just seeing that my good friend Russell Brown with Fort LA, Friends of Residential Treasures, which is a marvelous organization, he's got a comeback about the issue of importing materials from overseas, and he's saying, hasn't importing been happening for a long time? The Green Brothers imported materials from all over the world. And I would say absolutely, but it was more for, I would say, probably for more of an elite class. I think it
Yes.
wouldn't be quite so universal as now.
Right.
And
Yeah.
I think something that's happened in design, actually, and I was, yes, I've been talking to various people about this, is just that in our lifetimes, we've seen something called the sort of democratization of design, which has been understood as a good thing. You know, Habitat and IKEA and certain high street stores that brought, you know, sort of the idea of good taste to an affordable level for everybody to participate in, and many of us thought this was kind of a great thing, but that has also increased just the sheer volume of stuff that's being sort of shipped and produced, and we've created a whole kind of fast design, fast furniture industry that we're now seeing the implications
Sure.
of, I guess.
Yes. Yes. So since you're a great fan of LA, I read something about what is your least favorite building in LA, and I'd also like to discuss what
Oh,
is
did I?
some of your favorite buildings. But you know, when I read it, I just chuckled because the building happens to be about 2 blocks from my office, and I've always thought that this was a curse on the landscape, and it's a shame it didn't come down in an earthquake. But it's the Beverly Center.
Yeah, I have to say, it's a big mammoth lump. You know, there are times where going in, doing an intervention in a tight, small scale fabric can be interesting and inspired, like the Pompidou Center,
Yes.
which works. And I have to say, I don't think the Beverly Center accomplished that. It's so overscaled, and it's such a mammoth, impenetrable block. You know,
It is. It's a blob, and there isn't 1 inch of landscaping around this building. I find myself, this is why architecture and design is so important. I drive by the building a dozen times a day, and I can't wait to get to the next corner where I've passed the building. It just sort of repels you as you go by instead of attracting you.
yeah.
And that's what good design and thoughtful design creates.
Yeah. No, when I first moved here, I met somebody then who had this fantasy about putting bougainvillea over the entire Beverly Center. And I sort of thought that was wonderful. And then right now, there's a whole movement out there to do, at least fantasize about what to do with the Beverly Center, because in fact, some guys I know at a firm called the California office,
Mhm.
they have a speculative design for what to do with this Beverly Center. So it's something that even that's gone through its redesign. It recently went through a redesign, and David Adjaye, the architect, I will say, put in this beautiful store, you know, on the corner, but it's just a teeny little moment, you know, at the intersection of San Vicente and, is it San Vicente and La Cienega, I guess.
Right.
No, was it?
No,
Is it? Hang on a sec.
Beverly,
No, it's
Beverly and La Cienega.
Beverly and La Cienega.
Yeah. Well,
And
and
that's a nice,
it goes over to San Vicente,
right?
sure.
And that's a nice little moment. But no, the general massive mega mass, you know, is a blot on the landscape.
So, Frances, give me a couple examples of what you think is signature LA architecture, something that you like.
Well, of course, I mean, of course, the Schindler House, you know, I mean, it's everything. It's embedded in the landscape in that way that you're saying, you know, is something we love about LA, but also it was so innovative in testing a new structural system, the tilt up concrete, and then also working with this idea, or presenting this idea of the flow, the sort of inside outside flow, and then having the kind of warmth that you might find in the Frank Lloyd Wright, you know, or to my friend Russell Brown, even the Craftsman, it was a very different style, but it had something of that handcrafted and the sort of earthy kind of feel. So that's obviously a really fantastic building. I mean, I've been, as you mentioned earlier, the book that I've been working on, Common Ground, and so I've just been going to see so many multifamily housing projects, and I've been lucky enough to see some of the gems, of the last 100 years, and those include, I was just recently at some of the garden apartments, and I was at Village Green, and then I was at Chase Knowles in the Valley, and I was at Lincoln Place, which is near where I live, and somewhat utilitarian housing, but absolutely with flair, because designed with real thought and embedded into the landscape, and also creating a sense of sort of community and connection through the configuration of the buildings. And so those are absolutely lovely. And then I love modernity. I spent 18 years talking more about contemporary buildings than about historic buildings, so I absolutely love some of our contemporary buildings. Just recently, we are all seeing these great big 5 to 7 story residential mixed-use buildings going up on our arterials right now, and some of them, frankly, are not that welcoming. They're
Right.
kind of rather bland sort of behemoths, but some are done with real consideration for how to domesticate really a very large block. Michael Maltson did this with One Santa Fe when that went up back in what now, I'm forgetting how many years ago now, but at least a decade ago. But you have buildings now all over LA, some of which are really working with that sort of quite colossal scale, and figuring out ways to break it down and enhance the facades and articulate the facades and add depth and add shared open space and private open space, and a sense of connection to the outside through balconies and interesting cladding materials. And so there's some of that that's going on. There's some in West Hollywood. I recently saw the Fairfax project by Studio Untitled. That's a striking building. Harlan's a striking building. I mean, there's a whole number of architects who are doing work in that realm that's really interesting, and rethinking the courtyard. Acknowledging that the courtyard is really one of LA's wonderful contributions to a way of domestic living in LA.
Well, that concept has been around since the Greeks and the Romans,
Well,
it's very successful. It's always been successful.
It's very successful, and it obviously was imported to LA, through the missions, and then also through the Spanish style apartment courtyard housing, whose architects were so inspired by southern Spain. So the sort of the Spanish and in southern Spain, of course, you have the Arab influence, and in Arab culture you have the courtyard, and in Spanish culture you have the court. I mean, you have the Spanish, as you just said, you have the courtyard in so many cultures because it makes sense. And anyway, yes, it manifests itself here, and then it's adapted and it's added to, and then you have architects like Irving Gill and Schindler, and then now the contemporary architects, and obviously the craftsmen architects who did all the wonderful bungalow courts. But anyway, yes, now people are trying to figure out how to still integrate the courtyard when land is so incredibly costly, and a developer doesn't want to sort of waste, in inverted commas, waste any square inch. But some cities like West Hollywood and Santa Monica kind of really demand that there is.
Yes.
Yeah, they demand it, and you're getting better buildings as a result.
Yeah. So, Frances, you briefly mentioned your book. I'd like you to talk just for a few minutes a little bit about Common Ground, and why the subject of multifamily housing.
Well, I guess I guess I've lived for 30 years in an apartment building myself that actually is wrapped around
Hmm.
a little courtyard. And it was designed by one of our better known architects, but very early on in his career when he was not well known at all, really. And it's been a wonderful place to live. But over the years, I have very much become aware that in some ways, to stick around in an apartment, even when it's a really rather well designed one, is kind of not what one does in LA. What you do in LA is you buy your single family home and you live your somewhat self-contained lifestyle that affords you, and you also, by the way, build equity to boot. And kind of that's the dream. And I realized that I wasn't living the dream, and then I realized that so were many other.
Oh, we just went. I think we. Oh, there you go.
Sorry, I'm so sorry. I forgot to do what you told me to do, which was turn off interruptions. Anyway, I sort of really started thinking about the reality of many people's lived lives in LA, which is living in some form of multifamily building, and at best with great pleasure, because the building is designed in such a way that it affords a really great lifestyle, like the building I live in, like Village Green, like some of the bungalow courts, like some of the contemporary buildings. And yet the image that is put out there consistently is that the dream lifestyle here is the single family home. Now, I understand the financial reasons for that, obviously, and I also understand that there is a great desire for independence and connection to open space, but I also believe that there are many advantages, other kinds of advantages to multifamily living in LA when done at its best, underscore, because I completely appreciate that it can be awful. But I would say there's simultaneous with the 100+ years of experimentation that we have seen in Los Angeles or in the Southland in domestic living in the single family home, simultaneous with that, there has been also innovations in multifamily living, and LA has modeled one example after another of great multifamily living. And now it is particularly imperative that we appreciate that and learn from it, because now, frankly, the majority of people are in most of our cities in the Southland living in some form of multifamily. Most are renters. And when I say most, I literally mean most. In LA, it's something like it's just over 50% of Angelenos are renters. In West Hollywood, it's 78%. In Santa Monica, it's 71%. And of those renters, many of them are in some kind of multifamily living. Now, you have owners in multifamily and you have renters in single family, but where we're going in LA is towards a more multifamily future.
Right, and don't you find that the younger generation is more receptive and adaptive to this type of living? Because single family homes, especially in Los Angeles and most major cities, really have gotten to the point that they're unaffordable for the average person.
Oh, completely unaffordable.
Yeah.
Absolutely untenable. So
Right.
it's actually a very kind of unfair message that's being sent, which is kind of, you can have this too, when actually you can't, unless you have some kind of support system that helps you put down the down payment, or you happen to do sort of very well financially, because now you have to do very well financially, and that wasn't the case in the 1950s. And by the way, there is, of course, this other story that we are now also all becoming much more aware of, which was the way in which racially restrictive covenants and redlining was applied, to the point that, and the GI Bill and sort of mortgage lending practices, to the point that we also got this race and class segregation system, where
Yes.
you have a privileged class that becomes the home owning class. And then you have people excluded from that, many people of color, who wind up pushed out of the home owning class. And so you also have that, where you have wealth generation being in one sector of the society and
Right.
and excluded from in the other sector. And so that's something we all understand has to be also also redeemed somehow. So anyway, but obviously people who have been excluded from home ownership probably very much want home ownership.
Of course.
It's obviously very
Yes.
attractive, but what my book is doing is celebrating really great multifamily housing design, because there is really great multifamily housing design, and there are many people, and obviously that's young singles, and it's older singles, and it's young and older couples, but it's also, I would argue, it's also many families want to move when there's children. When children enter the picture, many people want those children to have a yard and there to be a garden.
Absolutely.
In my own case, I have one child who grew up in this apartment with friends in the neighboring apartments, and it was wonderful for her. She was an only child, and she had friends who were also only children living in the apartments in the same building. She had a great childhood as a consequence, and I would maintain that there are many people whose stories of that kind of lifestyle just are not told as much as the story of the house and the yard and all of that. And so I'm telling that other story, and it's exciting, and it's been so great to go around LA and meet people who are living and enjoying their spaces, whether it's 100-year-old bungalow court in Pasadena or a building built last year of market rate apartments in Santa Monica, where the garden's on the roof, and
right.
And your sunset drink is not on the deck per se. It's not on your own personal deck. It's up on the roof looking at the sunset. And what could be better with your neighbors?
Magic environments.
Yeah.
So, you mentioned a little bit ago, you are a fan of modernism. And I know we have, I think, possibly in the next week or so, we have Modernism Week in Palm Springs.
That's right. Yes.
And I think one of the talks is about Black modernisms in Southern California architecture.
Yes, no, absolutely. Yeah, no, I've actually become a board member of Modernism Week, and we all, what's not to love about Modernism Week. But one of the things that's sort of not to love about modernism per se is that even modernism, which is essentially seen as a very sort of progressive kind of movement, that even despite that, racial segregation still happened, and there was still challenges, and then within the profession itself, it has been somewhat limited in terms of who got to sort of play in the sandbox, I guess. So anyway, what's happening is those two things have converged, and what we're doing next week at Modernism Week is we're having a symposium. It's called Stories Untold: Black Modernists in Southern California, and it is looking at three things. First of all, it's looking at the imprint of African American builders and even developers in Palm Springs itself, where there was most definitely exclusion, and you had a Black community that helped build Palm Springs, built some of the clubs and lovely houses that the African American builders themselves would not have got access to.
No, they wouldn't.
They wouldn't have got. So we're telling that story, and we've got some amazing speakers: Tyrone Beeson from the LA Times, Dieter Crawford and Jarvis Crawford, both of the Palm Springs Black History Committee. Then we're having a panel, and it'll be so interesting. I promise you, it'll be so interesting. We're calling it Circle of Paul Williams, and this is about the Black architects who were essentially the same era. Some of them a bit younger, some of them more or less exactly the same age as Paul Williams, who were also building in LA. And that includes Ralph Vaughan, who partnered up with Heth Wharton and built, I just mentioned Lincoln Place, and Chase Knowles. He was a set designer and had been a set designer, worked on those buildings. James Garrett, who my friend Russell Brown, who's on this call, has been doing some research on for Fort LA. But James Garrett, who partnered up for a while with Gregory Ain, who was really a fascinating designer. We're going to be talking about him. We're going to be talking we're going to, I'm like running away with myself, and I'm suddenly just starting to forget. We're going to talk about Norma Sklaric, woman architect, who worked at Victor Gruen's and worked on PDC, had a very strong involvement with the PDC, really like a pivotal member of the team on the PDC. So a whole bunch of people that we're going to be. Oh, Robert, also AKA Robert Kennard, who's was partnered up with Arthur Silvers, designed the Mafundi building in Watts, about which there is currently a movement to preserve and save. But his daughter Gail Kennard, she's going to be speaking about her father and his work and that generation and also his passion for modernism. To circle back to what you just, how you set this up. So Gail Kennard talks about her dad as being absolutely die-hard modernist, you know. And so anyway, we're going to be talking about all of that, and it's going to be really interesting. Oh, and then we have Drake Dillard with Perkins and Will, who's going to kind of bring us up to the contemporary, and he's going to talk about Destination Crenshaw, which is the linear art park that's going in the Crenshaw district, which absolutely kind of emerged from the Black community and is a celebration of that history. So anyway, it's going to be super interesting, and it is going to be past to present.
Yeah. All right. Well, everybody should look into this, because I'm very, very interested in this. And I've only been to the Modernism Week a couple times, but it's a lot of fun. It's fascinating.
Yeah.
So listen,
Yeah. And there's some great
with everything that
now.
You're involved in, all your podcasts, your lectures, your books, all of this, what do you do in your spare time to sort of chill?
Do you know, I watch All Creatures Great and Small. Have you watched All Creatures Great and Small?
No.
Oh my God! If you want total respite from everything, watch All Creatures Great and Small. It's from the country that I grew up in, the UK, and it's an adaptation of a series of books that were written by a guy. His pen name was James Herriot, and he was a vet in Yorkshire in the 1930s. And he goes into this little village, and this is back when you had your own cow and you had a name. So your cow was Betty, you know, and you had your rabbits or your sheep or whatever. And he's the local vet, and he joins this eccentric guy and the brother who run the veterinary service, and you get steeped in the slow ways of English life in the 1930s. And there's of course lots of little dramas, you know, and who loves who and this and that, but it's complete respite. So that's one of the things I do. And I guess, you know, like we all have been doing since the pandemic, is walking. I have just walked and walked and walked. And that's been another great thing about this multifamily housing research, is I just sort of walk the neighborhood, and
I've been doing the same thing. I've been, you know, discovering things in my neighborhood that I'd never seen before. I've driven by them 100 times.
Yes.
I walk I start at about 5 o'clock in the morning, and I love walking around and looking at buildings, houses, commercial buildings. It's a very, very exciting way to discover the city.
It really is. It really is. And you get to peek in. You get to sort of peek through gates, you know, and wonder what's going on. And you get to see the gardens. I mean, the gardens are so wonderful. And to see them in kind of slow time, if you sort of walk every day in the same neighborhood, you kind of watch. On one of our streets near us, this lady, she literally grows corn on the sidewalk, and to watch, and the corn almost seems to kind of grow in front of your eyes. It's incredible how fast it goes. But anyway, to sort of watch it in real time growing with every evening walk is so lovely. Yeah.
Frances, I could sit and talk to you for hours. You're absolutely fascinating and really knowledgeable. I can't thank you enough for joining us today on Designers at Home. It was so much fun.
Well, it's lovely to talk to you, Mark. I hope I see you at Modernism Week.
Well, I hope you do. Anyway, thank you so much. And I really appreciated you taking the time.
Of course. Thank you for asking
And we look forward to your new book and your future podcasts.
Thank you. And this will now be, people can now find this
Yes, you
online. Is
can
that
find
right?
this on Instagram. It's on our YouTube channel. And now, Frances, how can people listen to some of your previous podcasts, the DnA podcasts that you have? How do they find these?
Oh, just at KCRW. It's all there at KCRW.
Okay.
So kcrw.com /DNA.
Yeah.
And then the book, I guess, comes out, it was meant to come out in the fall. And then I'm doing a lot of I'm actually doing more programming these days. So I'm sort of pushing other, it's more about other people. And so I'm doing a fair amount of programming at Helms Bakery District, and then with Modernism Week. And so there's some great stuff to see. There's a lovely show at Helms Bakery District right now, put on by A+D Museum, called Decoding Asian Urbanism, and it's about density, which we think we have a lot of in LA. And wait till you see some of these Asian cities, you'd think, oh my gosh,
Right.
we've still got ways to go. So anyway, doing a bunch of stuff, but you can find it about it all on francesanderton.com.
All right.
And
Great.
I really appreciate you asking and giving me a chance to plug.
All right. Well, good. Well, it's very worthwhile, and I encourage people to explore and check these out. Thank you, Frances. Thank you for joining us. Have a great weekend.
And you. And
all right.
you.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye. Anyway, thank you, everybody. I appreciate everybody watching today. We had a lovely audience, and I know all of you found Frances fascinating. Next Friday, we have another really great guest, is Jill Cole from the design firm of Cole, Martinez and Curtis. They have offices in Los Angeles, Napa Valley, San Francisco, and London. And I think you're going to find Jill really delightful. So please join us next Friday on Designers at Home.